So, I wanted to begin a series of videos where I attempt to coherently summarize, essentially, different philosophical works that I'm making my way through. Um, and I thought a fitting entry point would be some ancient philosophy. And I wanted to start with one of the Platonic dialogues that I just finished, and that is the Phaedo. The Phaedo is going to be the central focus. Um, and I regard it personally as an essential among Plato's canon of his dialogues, and it's fantastic not just as a work of philosophy, but is amazing also as a piece of Greek literature. It is fantastic in that aspect as well. Um, so one thing to remember about the Plato is it, along with two other dialogues, constitutes what is known as the Platonic trilogy. The first two belong to what is known as Plato's early period. These are Socrates' Defense and the Credo. And then, of course, we have the Phaedo to end things off. And this belongs to the middle period if you are to chronologically categorize Plato's dialogues. The Phaedo, I believe, precedes the Republic as well as the Symposium, just to give you an idea of where it is on the timeline. Now, what tethers these three dialogues together as a trilogy is that chronologically they depict the events of the trial of Socrates and, of course, subsequently the death of Socrates, the Phaedo being the final moments before Socrates' impending death. The thing about the first two is that they are very much a testament to Socrates' own philosophical conventions, his beliefs as they pertain to law, to justice, and so on. The third, and the one that I want to focus on the most, Phaedo, is really the first glimpse that we get into Plato's own philosophy. We get, I think, really what is the first look into the world of forms, which is, of course, an idea which is attributed to Plato, not Socrates. And so, yeah, I want to start by just kind of on a surface level going over the first two. In Socrates' defense, we get a look into the actual trial. Socrates is conducting his self-defense in response to two main accusations that have been levied upon him, and he's doing this in front of the Athenian jury. There are three main accusers to keep in mind here: Lycon, Anytus, and Meletus. They each have their own unique backstory. They all are kind of connected to Socrates in an interesting way. I'm not going to elaborate on that in this video because it's not particularly relevant, but it is interesting nonetheless. And the two main accusations Socrates is going up against here are corrupting the youth of Athens, as well as introducing new gods which conflict with the gods that have been officially endorsed by the state of Athens. And so Socrates sets out to tackle the corruption accusation first. He runs through how his unpopularity originated. He speaks of the Oracle of Delphi, the divine proclamation that came down through Pythia, and how that essentially kind of birthed the Socratic method. And that, you could really say, is where Socrates' unpopularity derives from, and really exposing the lack of knowledge among the Athenian populace when they in fact think that they know more than they do. So Socrates begins there. He makes some remarks to Meletus regarding his kind of illusory attention that he's paying towards the youth. He kind of exposes his genuine indifference in that regard, and makes a few other remarks regarding his deliberation about supernatural activity, and how, if he is in fact deliberating about these things, it is only logical then that he believes in supernatural beings. And so that comprises the majority of his defense. Of course, he is found guilty by a pretty narrow margin, and he is given a death sentence, which is a bit heart-wrenching, and it becomes more and more heart-wrenching, especially within the Phaedo, but it's also kind of uplifting in a way, with how Socrates deals with all of this. So this segues us, of course, into the Credo. This is the second dialogue, and it's named after a wealthy student of Socrates, also a friend of Socrates. This is in Socrates' cell at the prison. Only a day or so. It's kind of up in the air as to when Socrates is actually going to have his punishment imposed upon him. But Credo shows up, says, "I bribed the jailman. We've got a plan laid out. All we need for you to do is come along with us. We can get you out of here." And he wants Socrates to flee Athens. This is, you could say, motivated because Credo is a friend of Socrates, but it is also kind of motivated on Credo's part because of image. Credo does not want the image associated with him that he didn't make a valiant enough effort to get Socrates acquitted, essentially, or get him out. And so he wants Socrates desperately to come along with him. But Socrates makes a few remarks about expertise, about trusting the process of law, not responding to injustice with another injustice. He speaks of the social contract he's entered with the law of Athens and the good things that has granted for him, and how rules are not rules if we allow for individual will to simply bend them contingently based upon a individual conception of injustice. And so Socrates says, no, I'm going to stay put, and I'm going to accept my punishment as it has been handed to me. And then this brings us into the Phaedo. It's the longest of the three dialogues. It's really the most substantial. And as I said earlier, now we finally get an actual glimpse into Plato's philosophy, and not just what Socrates believes. What happens in the Phaedo is the character named Phaedo is having an exchange with Echecrates. Echecrates was not there, he was not present in the moments leading up to Socrates' death, but Phaedo was. And so Echecrates wants Phaedo to retell the sequence of events that led up to Socrates' demise. And so Phaedo does this, he remembers it all quite well, and he describes how the people who were there, who were present, were kind of amazed by Socrates' disposition. He was not fazed at all in the face of death, and he was completely devoid of any grief whatsoever. And this amazed people. They asked Socrates, how do you do this? Why is this? So Socrates begins the dialogue with a pretty profound description of the relationship, or the ideal relationship, between the philosopher and death. Socrates maintains that the philosopher should never be afraid of death, because the life of a philosopher is essentially a kind of preparation for death. The reason he believes this is because Socrates believes in a fundamental divide between soul and body. He privileges the soul above the body, and that the soul is always making the attempt to ascertain absolute truth. It sets out in the world and wants to gain this eternal, immutable knowledge. The issue, though, is that the body is an impediment to this to this search. We have different bodily desires, whether they be sexual, whether we have hunger or thirst. These things are constantly getting in the way of the soul's will for the divine, for the eternal. And so the philosopher recognizes that death is a pathway. There is an afterlife, and death is a direct pathway leading to where absolute knowledge can be ascertained. And the philosopher has special privilege in this regard, entering into the world of forms, which we'll get into in a bit. And so Socrates' interlocutors, they respond by asking, if this is the case, if philosophers are not scared of death, why is it that philosophers are against suicide, for instance? And Socrates has a response for this as well. Simply, he believes that the gods have dominion over us, and for that reason, it would be unjust for us to end our lives against the gods' will. It is their decision when we can segue into the afterlife, because we're ultimately objects of the gods. And if you had an object that decided to terminate itself against your own will, you would be upset as well. And so this is Socrates' line of reasoning against suicide. So you could say the main basis for Socrates' acceptance of death, for his courage that he brings to death, is the idea of an immortal soul. And this is what the Phaedo is really centered on. Socrates, among his interlocutors, brings to the table three different arguments. The first one is known as a cyclical argument, or what is deemed the argument of opposites. The main contention here is that which admits of generation or change does so in regard to the opposite state. So, for example, for something to become larger, it presupposes that it must have been smaller. And this is what governs the relationship between all the pairs of opposites, all the different antagonisms that exist in the world. It exists between the just and the unjust, right and wrong, beauty and ugliness, big and small. Accompanying these pairs of opposites, there's also a pair of correlative processes. For example, between big and small, there's increase and decrease, or shrink and grow. And these processes exist for every pair of opposites. Socrates believes that these correlative processes are essential because they maintain the balance of the universe. If the process of increasing was to cease to exist, then everything in the world would remain small. We would have nothing left that's large. So it's imperative that we have the two processes to complement each other, to supplement each other, and it keeps everything in balance. For Socrates, life and death are not any different from the other pairs of opposites. We have life and death, and the process from life to death is dying. So in Socrates' head, if we are to make the next step from the other pair of opposites that we've discussed, there must be some correlative process from death to life. Otherwise, there would be no balance. Everything would die, and there would be no life left. This is kind of a suspect argument, I think, and the main reason is because Socrates makes a pretty big leap in comparing the nature of the life and death antagonism with other opposites, especially the ones he mentions, like big and small, because those are comparatives, right? So something can become bigger, it can become smaller, but something cannot be more alive, at least not in a metaphorical sense. Something cannot become deader. It can't be more dead. So in this sense, life and death are contraries. They're not comparatives. They're not quite contradictories, which gets into Aristotelian logic, the law of the excluded middle. That would be something like alive and not alive, where it's one or the other. But life and death perhaps offers a third option, maybe, who knows. But that's the first argument that Socrates employs. The next one is, and this is where we really get an introduction into the ideas of Plato. The next one is the argument of recollection. And this is where the world of forms comes into play as well, as the idea of knowledge as recollection. Two of the main interlocutors that bring up opposition to Socrates throughout the dialogue, Simmias and Cebes, they're in agreement with Socrates on the doctrine of recollection. And there's sort of a funny moment, an ironic moment, not necessarily Socratic irony, but irony in the sense that we understand it and use it in everyday life. where they're discussing the doctrine of recollection, and Simmias basically says, "Man, I can't quite remember the doctrine of recollection. Can you help me recall it? Can you remind me of it again?" And so Socrates does this. He goes through it again. And it's pretty simple. It's actually elaborated upon much more in the dialogue Minos, where Socrates is having an exchange with a student of his regarding geometry. But the doctrine of recollection maintains that some knowledge that we acquire is not actually new knowledge. We're not actually learning something anew. Rather, some knowledge, as we think it to be new, is actually simply recalling things that we have forgotten that we already knew some time ago. This is where you could say the world of forms comes into play. Now, what exactly are forms? With a capital F, it should be noted. For Plato, the world of forms, and this is where Plato kind of departs from the early modern period of philosophy with the rationalists, for example. Take somebody like Descartes. Where he departs is the world of forms is not some innate cognitive faculty that we all have. The world of forms is literally another world. It's something that we can actually travel to through death, of course. That is the only passageway to it. And the world of forms is eternal. It's non-composite. It's immutable. It is divine. It's invisible. It's all of these things. And it houses concepts and attributes and ideas in of themselves. It is the reality of certain things that we recognize through the sensory world. Some of the examples, well, really the main one he zeroes in on is equality. If you had two sticks, for example, you would say, well, you could say these are equal, but they're not absolutely equal. For Plato, nothing in the physical world ever admits of absolute equality. Absolute equality can only be found in the world of forms, equality with a capital E, if you will. And so Plato recognizes that we are aware of the world of forms, because when we make observations of equality, we are also kind of aware that that equality is deficient. It isn't absolute equality. Since we don't gain the knowledge of absolute equality in the sensory world, it must be innate. We must have some understanding of it which we bring to the table. For Plato, this means that the soul, before we're born, experiences the world of forms, ascertains what the absolute reality is of these different attributes and concepts, and then we're born into the real world, and this is how we employ these concepts. This is how we can call something beautiful, because that beautiful thing in the natural world, in some way, to one degree or another, participates in the form of beauty, of absolute beauty. So this is one of the arguments Plato uses for the immortality of the soul. The last one he uses is kind of brief. It's the affinity argument. And it simply states that, as I said, the world of forms is something divine, it's immutable, it's invisible, and the soul is more like this than the body is. So after death, it is only natural for the soul to enter the world of forms. Because, of course, the soul does not terminate when we die. Following Socrates' line of reasonings, he has the two main interlocutors that I mentioned earlier, Simmias and Cebes. They have objections. Simmias says, well, what if I think of the soul as a sort of harmony and the body as the musical instrument which produces it? The harmony is something invisible, right? We can't actually see it, but it kind of governs the musical instrument, the way that a soul governs all the fundamental antagonisms of the body and keeps everything in harmony and balance. With the musical instrument, once it's destroyed, the melody is gone. The harmony is gone. The balance is gone. And so Simmias thinks that maybe this is a possible objection to Socrates' idea of the immortal soul. Socrates simply responds by bringing up again the argument of recollection, which Simmias has already agreed to, and of course it fundamentally contradicts, and so Simmias is forced